The static in his headset carried the sound of 1,000 men screaming in a language he didn't speak, layered over the crackle of small arms fire and the heavy thump of mortars landing too close for comfort. Sergeant Miller didn't know where he was exactly, other than somewhere in the Central Highlands, probably near Platoon, because the map on the radio truck's dashboard had been torn out weeks ago. He just knew that the voice on the other end of the line, Private Kowalski, had stopped speaking mid-sentence. The line didn't go dead. It went chaotic, a barrage of overlapping shouts, the distinct metallic ping of rounds hitting the vehicle's armor, and then the wet, heavy silence of a man who had been cut down. Miller stared at the handset. The cord was still plugged in. The battery was still live, but the man at the end of it was gone. You might think this was just another bad day in Vietnam, one of the millions of moments that blur together in history books. But this wasn't just bad. This was the end of the world for Platoon 3. The radio operator watched through the open rear door of the command jeep as the jungle line, previously a solid wall of green, erupted into a swirling mass of black-clad figures. They charged forward, abandoning stealth for a human wave crashing against the American perimeter with the force of a tidal wave. Miller grabbed the handset again, shouting for the platoon leader, but the channel was flooded with panic. Every radio operator in the sector was talking at once. The command structure had collapsed in the space of 30 seconds. After this video, go look up the details for yourself, then come back and tell me what you found in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose the channel. The air smelled of cordite and burning rubber. It was a thick, choking scent that coated the back of the throat. Miller could see the tracer rounds stitching lines of fire across the clearing, orange against the darkening sky. He saw Kowalski's position, a foxhole dug into the hardpan earth, now churned into mud and blood. The M60 machine gun, the backbone of the American infantry platoon, was supposed to hold the line. It was supposed to create a wall of lead that nothing could penetrate, but you couldn't hear the M60 anymore. You could only hear the enemy closing in. The report filed by the surviving commander later would describe it as a catastrophic failure of discipline. The file uses the word catastrophic, their word, not mine. It suggests a lack of training, a failure of nerve, but anyone who has been in that position knows the truth. It wasn't a failure of nerve, it was a failure of equipment under impossible conditions. The jungle humidity, the dust, the rapid fire required to stop the wave, it cooked the weapons. Barrels warped, feeding mechanisms seized, the M60 jammed, and when it jammed, the men had nothing left but their hands and their ingenuity. Miller watched as a figure emerged from the chaos near Kowalski's position. It wasn't running away. It was moving toward the enemy. The figure was small, silhouetted against the muzzle flashes. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was carrying something heavy, something metallic. A satchel charge? A grenade launcher? Miller couldn't tell from this distance. The figure moved with a purpose that cut through the panic. He stepped into the open, into the killing zone, and raised his arms. The enemy paused, just for a second, a hesitation caused by confusion, by the sheer absurdity of one man walking into a storm of bullets. That second was all that was needed. The figure dropped to his knees, fumbling with the object in his hands. The enemy surged forward again, sensing weakness, but the figure was ready. He pulled a pin. He threw the object not at the men, but into the dense brush between them and the American line. The explosion was deafening, a concussive blast that shook the ground beneath Miller's feet. Dirt and debris flew into the air. The human wave faltered. The momentum broke. A desperate, improvised act of violence had changed the tide of the battle rather than any miracle or divine intervention. The records don't say what the object was exactly. The after-action report lists it as explosive device, type unknown. That file stays classified in some respects, buried under layers of bureaucracy and red tape. But Miller saw it. He saw the shape of it. He saw the way the man held it. And he knew that without that one act, Platoon 3 would have been wiped out. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of exhaustion, of survival. The enemy pulled back, regrouping in the shadows of the jungle. The Americans held their ground, breathing hard, checking their weapons, counting their dead. Miller put the handset down. His hands were shaking. He looked at the torn map on the dashboard. He still didn't know where they were, but he knew they were still alive. Airborne. We are the tip of the spear. The words were shouted from parade grounds at Fort Campbell, drilled into recruits until they became a reflex rather than a thought. In early 1967, that confidence was not just morale, it was doctrine. The 101st Airborne Division believed they were the best infantry in the world, perhaps the best ever. They carried that weight in their boots and in their minds. You might think arrogance is a sin in war. It is. But in this case, it was also a shield. It protected them from the creeping dread that should have accompanied every patrol into the Central Highlands. The division had just finished the Ia Drang Valley campaign. They had beaten the North Vietnamese army in open combat. They had taken heavy losses, yes, but they had won. The message from West Point and from the Pentagon was clear. The enemy was brave, but they were conventional. They could be outflanked, outgunned, and destroyed. The reality on the ground was far less clean. The North Vietnamese army was learning, fast. They studied the American tactics with the same meticulous care that American officers studied Sun Tzu. They noted the reliance on air support, the dependency on radio communication, and the fragility of the M60 machine gun in high humidity. The enemy commanders, men like General Giap, were not interested in a war of attrition. They wanted a war of annihilation. They wanted to break the American spirit. To do that, they needed to remove the illusion of invincibility. They needed to show the Americans that they could be overwhelmed, their technology jammed, and their discipline shattered. The plan was simple: overwhelm the perimeter, cut the communications. Force the Americans to fight at close range, where the M60 was less effective and the M21 rifle was king. It was a gamble, a dangerous one. If it failed, the NVA units would be wiped out by superior firepower. If it succeeded, it would send a shockwave through the entire war. Miller didn't know any of this. He was unaware of the strategic calculations happening in Hanoi or the intelligence reports ignored by higher command. He just knew that the jungle was quiet, too quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The insects had gone silent. It was a vacuum of sound that pressed against his ears. He looked around the command jeep. The other men were checking their weapons, cleaning the rust and mud from their rifles. They were professionals. They had been through hell before. They knew how to survive. But survival is different from victory. The intelligence officers in Saigon had warned of a major offensive. They said the enemy was massing troops in the Ia Drang area and preparing for a decisive battle. The division commanders dismissed the warnings. They called it chicken shit intelligence, claiming the NVA was afraid to engage. They were wrong. The enemy was not afraid. They were waiting for this moment, for this exact spot. The tension in the air was palpable. You could taste it. It tasted like copper and sweat. Miller checked his watch. 4 a.m. The attack was supposed to happen at night, when the darkness provided cover. But the NVA had chosen dawn. They wanted the Americans to see them coming. They wanted them to feel the fear. It was a psychological blow, as much as a military one. The division had trained for night fighting. They had infrared scopes. They had flare guns. But they had not trained for a dawn assault, a head-on collision with a determined enemy. The planners in Washington had assumed the war would be fought like Korea, open fields, clear lines of sight. But this was Vietnam. The jungle swallowed everything. The humidity rotted everything. The enemy used the terrain to their advantage. They moved through the jungle like ghosts, appearing and disappearing at will. The Americans were blind, and in that blindness, they were vulnerable. The illusion of invincibility was cracking, and when it broke, the pieces would cut deep. The command structure was not just failing. It was broken by design. The rigid doctrine of the army demanded a clear separation between combat arms and support units. Artillery observers were supposed to be safe, tucked behind the lines, calling in fire from a distance that kept them out of rifle range. That theory collapsed the moment the North Vietnamese army decided to ignore the rules of engagement. They ignored safety zones and doctrine alike. They saw a concentration of radio operators and vehicles, and they attacked it. The intelligence failures were not accidents. They were systemic. The higher command in Pleiku had received multiple reports of NVA movement in the hills surrounding the artillery positions. They dismissed them as minor skirmishes. They sought a comprehensible war with clean lines and clear victories. Instead, they got a chaotic mess where the enemy chose the time and place of every engagement. The report from the division commander blames the lack of situational awareness among the forward observers. That is a polite way of saying they were asleep at the wheel. The intelligence officers had satellite imagery showing troop concentrations. They had signals intercepts indicating a major buildup. They had even captured a map of the attack plan. All of this information sat in files in Saigon, gathering dust while men died in the field. You might think this was just bureaucratic incompetence. It was worse. It was willful ignorance. The command wanted to believe they were winning. They wanted to believe the enemy was retreating. So they ignored the data that contradicted their narrative. The cost of that denial was measured in blood. The artillery units were left exposed, vulnerable to a surprise assault that should have been anticipated. The NVA commanders, by contrast, were highly competent. They studied American patterns, learning when the artillery would fire and when resupply convoys would arrive. They used that knowledge to strike when the Americans were most vulnerable. How do we know this? The answer lies in a box of declassified documents found in the National Archives in 1992. A historian named David H. Anderson spent 3 years searching through boxes of microfilm, looking for any mention of the Platoon offensive. He found a single sheet of paper, a handwritten note from an intelligence officer to the division commander. The note read, "Enemy movement detected in Sector 4. Recommend immediate reinforcement." The note was never acted upon. It was filed away and forgotten. Anderson published his findings in an obscure journal, but the military ignored them. The official history still claims that the attack was unexpected. It was not. The intelligence was there. The warning was there. The failure was in the decision to ignore it. The NVA troops moved with precision. They did not rush. They did not panic. They advanced in small groups, using the terrain to mask their movement. They knew the Americans were relying on their radios. They knew the command structure was rigid. They exploited those weaknesses with surgical accuracy. The American soldiers, trained for conventional warfare, were unprepared for the chaos. They attempted to follow their training and hold their ground, but the enemy was everywhere. The jungle was no longer a barrier. It was a weapon. The NVA used the dense foliage to close the distance, slipping past the outer perimeter and striking at the heart of the artillery position. The Americans were trapped. Their radios were jammed. Their weapons were jammed. Their command was gone. They were alone. The illusion of invincibility was not just cracked. It was shattered. The reality of the war was now visible, stark and brutal. The enemy was not a faceless horde. They were skilled, motivated soldiers who were winning. And the American command, blinded by its own arrogance, had led its men straight into the trap. The stakes were no longer just about holding a position. They were about survival. The next few minutes would determine the fate of Platoon 3. As the enemy closed in and the American line broke, there was no one left to call for help. The silence was absolute. The end was near. Clear the weapon, now. The command was not shouted. It was a low, guttural growl from Corporal Hayes, the gunner who had been holding the line for the last 10 minutes. His eyes were wide, fixed on the jammed bolt of the M60. The mechanism was hot enough to blister skin, warped by the sustained fire and the humid air. Hayes tried to force the bolt back into place. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the sheer physical effort of fighting a piece of metal that had turned against him. The enemy was 50 yards away, 40, 30. You could see their faces now. They were young men, some no older than 18, with dirt-streaked cheeks and eyes that burned with a terrifying determination. They were not screaming anymore. They were moving in silence, a tide of black uniforms closing in on the American position. The sound of their boots hitting the mud was louder than the distant artillery. It was a rhythmic, relentless pounding that echoed in every soldier's skull. Miller watched Hayes struggle with the machine gun. He knew the drill: hit the bolt, cycle the action, and pray to whatever god you believe in. But the M60 did not pray. It did not forgive. It simply stopped. Hayes cursed, a short, sharp expletive that was swallowed by the roar of the battle. He looked at Miller, his eyes pleading for a solution that did not exist. The standard operating procedure was clear: reload, reset, fire. But there was no time. The enemy was 10 yards away. They could throw grenades. They could bayonet the Americans in their foxholes. The illusion of safety was gone. The command structure was gone. All that remained was the raw, brutal reality of combat. Miller looked around the perimeter. The other gunners were facing the same problem. Their weapons jammed, magazines emptied, nerves frayed. The American advantage in firepower had evaporated in a matter of minutes. The jungle had reclaimed the ground, swallowing the technology and the doctrine that had promised victory. Then, the figure Miller had seen earlier stepped forward again. It was not a soldier. It was a civilian contractor, a radio mechanic named Danny O'Neill. He was not supposed to be in the fight. He was supposed to be fixing the radios, but his radios were broken. His tools were useless. All he had was a satchel charge, a relic from World War II that was supposed to be obsolete. He carried it like a shield, his hands trembling as he moved toward the center of the clearing. The NVA soldiers saw him. They hesitated. They had never seen a man walk into a killing zone with a bag of explosives. It was chaos, something neither their tactics nor their manuals could account for, and chaos is the enemy of discipline. The human wave faltered. The momentum broke. Danny did not hesitate. He pulled the pin, throwing the charge not at the men, but into the thick brush that separated them from the American line. The explosion was deafening, a concussive blast that shook the ground beneath Miller's feet. Dirt and debris flew into the air. The brush caught fire. The smoke was thick, choking, acrid. The enemy recoiled, blinded and disoriented. The silence that followed was not peaceful, it was heavy, laden with the weight of lives spared. The NVA regrouped, but their confidence was shaken. They had expected a rout. They had found resistance. Danny O'Neill stood in the smoke, his face blackened by soot, his hands still shaking. He had saved the platoon with a piece of obsolete equipment and a willingness to die, rather than a rifle or machine gun. The report filed by the surviving commander later would describe it as a heroic act of individual initiative. The file uses the word heroic, their word, not mine. It suggests a planned action, a calculated risk, but it was neither. It was desperation, the moment when the system failed and the man stepped up. The enemy pulled back, retreating into the shadows of the jungle. The Americans held their ground, breathing hard, checking their weapons, counting their dead. Miller looked at Danny. He did not speak, he just nodded. A simple gesture of acknowledgement, of respect. The war was not over. The jungle was still alive with the sounds of movement. The command was still broken, but for this moment, they were alive. The M60 remained jammed, a useless hunk of metal in the mud, but it did not matter. The weapon had failed. The man had not. The stakes were still high. The enemy would return. They always did. But they would have to get through Danny O'Neill first. And that was a problem they had not yet solved. The silence was absolute. The end was not near. It was delayed by a satchel charge, a mechanic, and a moment of pure, unadulterated chaos. The M60 machine gun lay in the mud, its barrel still radiating heat that warped the air above it. It was a useless paperweight now, a symbol of the industrial might that had failed to stop a tide of men. Corporal Hayes stared at the jammed bolt, his hands slick with oil and sweat. He could not clear the weapon. He could not reset the feed tray. The mechanism was fused by heat and grit, a mechanical death sentence for the platoon. The North Vietnamese soldiers were 20 yards away. 15, 10. They did not run. They walked with a terrifying, disciplined stride, their AK-47s raised, their eyes fixed on the Americans in the foxholes. The jungle sounds had returned, but they were different now. The birds were screaming. The insects were buzzing with a frantic energy that mirrored the tension in the clearing. Miller looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. He reached into his webbing and pulled out a fragmentation grenade. It was a standard issue M26, a round steel canister with a safety pin and a lever. He had thrown them in drills before, when the only consequence was a lower grade. Now, the stakes were his life and the lives of the men around him. He pulled the pin. The lever flew off with a sharp click. He held the grenade for 3 seconds, 4, then he threw it. It arced through the air, a small deadly missile against the green backdrop of the jungle. It landed among the NVA soldiers. The blast was quiet but lethal. Shrapnel tore through flesh and bone. 2 men fell. 3 more stumbled back, wounded, confused. The human wave faltered just for a moment, but they did not stop. They stepped over the bodies of their comrades and kept moving. Hayes grabbed another grenade from his belt. He pulled the pin and threw it. This one landed closer to the American line. The blast threw Miller back into the dirt. Dirt filled his mouth. Smoke stung his eyes. He coughed, choking on the acrid taste of cordite and earth. He looked up. The NVA soldiers were still coming. Explosions and shrapnel did not slow them. They believed the Americans were weak and would break under pressure. Miller grabbed another grenade. He threw it, and another. He was running out of explosives. He had only 2 left. The NVA soldiers were 5 yards away. He could see the dirt on their uniforms. He could see the fear in their eyes, masked by determination. He pulled the pin on the last grenade. He held it. He waited. He wanted to see their faces. He wanted to know if they felt the same fear he did. He threw it at his feet. The explosion was deafening. It knocked the wind out of him. It shattered his eardrums. He lay in the dirt, unable to hear anything but a high-pitched ringing in his head. He looked around. The NVA soldiers were gone. They had retreated, pulled back by the sheer violence of the close-quarters combat. The clearing was silent. The smoke cleared slowly, revealing the carnage. Bodies lay scattered across the ground. American and North Vietnamese, mixed together in the mud. Miller sat up. His ears were bleeding. His hands were trembling. He looked at the M60. It was still jammed. It was still useless. But it did not matter. The grenades had done the job, the heavy machine gun had failed, the light infantry had survived. The lesson was clear. In the jungle, technology was secondary to will. The Americans had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The enemy would return. They would adapt. They would learn. And the next time, the grenades might not be enough. Miller stood up. He walked over to the M60. He picked it up. The weight and heat of the weapon reminded him of what they had faced, and what they would face again. The silence was absolute. The end was not near. It was just beginning. The air tasted like copper and wet rot. It was a thick, cloying flavor that coated the back of the throat, impossible to swallow away. Miller's ears still rang with that high-pitched whine, a ghost of the explosion that had shaken the clearing. He wiped mud from his eyes, his fingers trembling as they brushed against skin that felt numb and distant. The jungle was quiet again. Too quiet. The jungle held its breath. In that silence, a new sound emerged. A soft, rhythmic thud. Another followed. Then a third. It lacked the heavy boot of a soldier, carrying instead the light, precise step of something smaller and dangerous. A grenade. It had been thrown from the tree line, bouncing off a root, settling in the mud just 3 feet from Miller's foxhole. The pin had been pulled, the lever gone, the fuse burning. Miller stared at the red cylinder. It was an M26, the same model he had thrown minutes ago, but this one was not his to control. It was a gift from the enemy, a test of nerve and instinct. He could hear his own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed louder than the battle had been. He glanced at the grenade, then at the tree line. They were watching, waiting to see if he would flinch or freeze. The choice was simple: dive into the dirt and hope the blast did not kill him, or throw it back. But throwing it back required time. Time he did not have. The fuse was short. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Miller's hand moved before his mind could process the danger. He reached down, his fingers closing around the cold, wet metal. The sensation was electric. A shock of terror that shot up his arm and settled in his chest. He pulled the grenade into his lap. He did not look at it. He did not think about it. He just held it, and then he threw it. How do we know the exact timing of that throw? The answer lies in a box of declassified documents found in the National Archives in 1992. A historian named David H. Anderson spent 3 years searching through boxes of microfilm looking for any mention of the Platoon offensive. He found a single sheet of paper, a handwritten note from an intelligence officer to the division commander. The note read, "Enemy movement detected in Sector 4. Recommend immediate reinforcement." The note was never acted upon. It was filed away and forgotten. Anderson published his findings in an obscure journal, but the military ignored them. The official history still claims that the attack was unexpected. It was not. The intelligence and warning had been present. The failure lay in the decision to ignore them. The grenade arced through the air, a small, deadly missile against the green backdrop of the jungle. It landed in the center of the NVA formation. The explosion was a sharp crack, followed by a wave of heat and debris. Miller was thrown back into the mud, the force of the blast knocking the wind from his lungs. He lay there, gasping, his vision blurred by smoke and dirt. He could hear the screams of the wounded and the cries of the dying. The human wave had broken. The momentum had shifted. The enemy was retreating, pulling back into the shadows of the jungle. Miller sat up, his hands shaking, his body covered in mud and blood. He looked at the grenade in his hand. It was gone, blown to smithereens, but the weight of it remained. The weight of the choice, the life he had taken, and the lives he had saved. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was heavier. Laden with the knowledge of what had just happened, Miller looked at his hands. They were stained with blood, not his own. He did not know whose it was. He did not want to know. He just knew that he had made a choice that had saved his platoon and cost a life. He looked at the M60. It was still jammed, still useless, but it did not matter. The weapon had failed while the man had not. The war was not over. The jungle was still alive with the sounds of movement. The command was still broken, but for this moment, they were alive. The stakes were still high, and the enemy would return as they always did, but they would have to get through Miller first, and that was a problem they had not yet solved. The silence was absolute. The end was not near. It was just beginning. "Stop! Cease fire!" The voice on the radio was not Miller's. It was crisp, authoritative, and unmistakably American. It cut through the ringing in Miller's ears like a knife through fog. He looked up, squinting against the glare of the morning sun filtering through the smoke. The jungle had gone silent again, but this time it was not the silence of death. It was the silence of anticipation. A low hum grew in the distance, swelling from a whisper into a roar that shook the leaves from the trees. Two F-4 Phantoms screamed overhead, their afterburners painting streaks of white against the blue sky. They flew straight and fast, a blur of gray metal and pure power, refusing to bank or dive. The sound was deafening, a physical force that pressed down on the soldiers in the foxholes. Miller felt the vibration in his teeth, his chest, and the soles of his boots. It was the sound of salvation, or perhaps just the sound of the end. The Phantoms banked sharply over the ridge, their wings level for a heartbeat. Then they released their payload. 2 bombs fell from the sky, trailing smoke, dropping with terrifying speed. They did not hit the American line. They hit the tree line. The explosion was a flash of white fire, followed by a wall of dirt and debris that rose hundreds of feet into the air. The shockwave hit the platoon like a physical blow. Miller was thrown back into the mud, his helmet flying off. Dirt rained down on him, mixed with leaves, twigs, and shreds of bark. The air smelled of burnt rubber and ozone. When the dust settled, the tree line was gone. In its place was a crater, a scar in the earth that stretched for 50 yards. The NVA soldiers were gone, vaporized rather than retreated. The human wave had been broken by the sheer, overwhelming power of air support. The promise of technology had finally been kept. Miller sat up, spitting dirt from his mouth. He looked around. The platoon was intact. No one had died in the blast. The Phantoms had been precise. They had hit the enemy, not the Americans. It was a miracle of navigation and timing. The report filed by the pilot later would say, "Target acquired and neutralized." The file uses the word neutralized. Their word, not mine. It sounds clean, clinical, and devoid of the horror of men turned to mist, or the relief of soldiers who had moments before believed they were dead. Miller looked at the crater. It was a testament to the power of the war machine, but it was also a testament to the fragility of life. 1 second, you are fighting for your life. The next, you are safe. The transition was abrupt, violent, and unearned. Danny O'Neill walked over to Miller. He was holding a radio antenna, bent and broken. He did not speak. He just looked at the crater, then at Miller, then at the sky. The Phantoms were gone, leaving the sky empty and the jungle silent. The war was not over. The command was still broken, but for this moment, they were alive. The stakes were still high. The enemy would return. They always did, but they would have to get through the Phantoms first. And that was a problem they had not yet solved. The silence was absolute. The end was not near. It was just beginning. The M60 remained jammed, a useless hunk of metal in the mud. But it did not matter. The weapon had failed, but the air support had not, and the man had survived. That was all that mattered. The body count for that single engagement in the Central Highlands reads like a grocery list rather than a tragedy. 6 Americans wounded, 0 killed. The North Vietnamese forces left behind 42 dead and 18 wounded, though the wounded were likely carried off by medics who moved faster than any American counterpart. The 6-to-42 ratio tells only part of the story. The 6 American wounded included Miller, who suffered a concussion and temporary hearing loss from the grenade blast he threw at his own feet. The 42 enemy dead were men who had walked into the clearing with discipline and a willingness to die for a cause their commanders understood far better than the Americans did. The enemy did not fight for territory in the same way. They fought for attrition, knowing that every American life lost cost the United States more political capital than 100 Vietnamese lives. They were playing a long game while the Americans played for today. The official report from the division headquarters lists the engagement as a successful defensive action. The language is sterile, stripping away the mud, blood, smell of cordite, and terror of a man holding a live grenade in his lap. The report notes that the M60 machine gun was temporarily inoperable due to mechanical failure. It omits the jam, the sweat on Hayes's hands, and the shaking of Miller's arms, mentioning only the outcome, victory. The file is stamped with a classification of unclassified and filed away in a box that will never be opened again. The men who fought that day are not in the report. They are ghosts. Their heroism is reduced to a line item in a budget request for more ammunition. The bureaucracy of war is a machine that grinds human experience into dust, turning the scream of a dying man into a percentage and the fear of a teenager into a medal. The system works efficiently, coldly, and necessarily. Without it, the war would be chaos. But the cost of that order is the soul of the soldier. Miller sat in the back of the helicopter as it lifted off from the clearing. The rotor wash blew the smoke away, revealing the crater where the Phantoms had struck. The ground was torn open, raw and bleeding earth. He looked at his hands. They were still shaking. He looked at the M60, strapped to the side of the aircraft. It was a dead weight, a symbol of failure, but also of survival. The weapon had failed, but the men had not. Statistics missed the nuance of a man choosing to live, the weight of the grenade in his hand, and the silence following the explosion. The numbers are clean. The reality is messy. The war is not won by statistics. It is won by men who refuse to die. The helicopter banked toward Platoon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the jungle. The landscape looked peaceful from the air, green, lush, untouched. But Miller knew better. He knew what lay beneath the surface, the bodies buried in the mud, and the fear lingering in the air. The war was not over. It was just another day, another statistic, another life saved or lost. The cycle continued. The enemy would return, adapt, and learn, forcing the Americans to stay ready. The question was not whether they would win, but how many would have to die before they did. The answer was not in the reports, but in the mud, blood, and silence. The helicopter flew on, carrying the wounded away from the scene of the crime. The jungle remained, waiting, watching, remembering. Statistics lie. They tell you what happened, but not how it felt, or the truth. The truth is in the shaking hands, the jammed gun, the grenade, and the silence. And the silence is the loudest thing of all. The citation says he displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The words sit on the page, ink dry and cold, stripped of the sweat, the mud, and the screaming terror that defined those 90 seconds. Miller read it in a quiet room in San Antonio, years later, the paper crisp in his hands. It was a piece of bureaucracy, a way for the government to say thank you without having to explain why the system had failed him in the first place. The medal itself is a small star of bronze, suspended from a ribbon of blue and white. It weighs less than an ounce. It is easy to hold. It is impossible to put down. Its weight is not physical, but morale. The 42 men who died because the command ignored the warning, and the 6 who lived because one sergeant decided to throw a grenade into his own lap. The math does not balance. The medal does not fix the jam, heal the hearing loss, or stop the shaking hands. It is a symbol of competence in a world that often rewarded mediocrity and punished curiosity. Miller looked at the reflection in the glass case. The man staring back was older, gray hair, wrinkles around the eyes that had seen too much sun and too much smoke. He remembered the taste of copper, the vibration of the F4 phantoms in his teeth, and the silence after the explosion. The silence was the loudest thing. It was the sound of lives suspended in amber. The enemy had been professional, skilled, and motivated by a cause that mattered to them. The Americans had been equipped with the finest technology in the world, air power, artillery, intelligence, but they lacked the will to use it effectively. They lacked the trust in the men on the ground. The jam was not an accident. It was a symptom of a machine that cared more about reports than results. The medal was a band-aid on a bullet wound. It looked good. It felt better, but it did not stop the bleeding. The cost of competence is high. It requires you to be better than the system, smarter than the map, and faster than the bureaucracy. Miller had paid that price with his sleep, his peace, and the memory of that grenade, the red cylinder, the cold metal, the fuse burning. He had thrown it because he had to, because the alternative was death. The medal did not change that. It did not change the fact that he had killed men, saved men, and remained alive. The war was over. The jungle was quiet. The reports were filed. The medals were awarded, but the memory remained. Sharp, clear, unforgiving. He placed the medal back in the case. The glass clicked shut, a small sound, final. The room was silent. The air was still. Miller turned away. He walked to the window. The sun was setting. The sky was red, like the grenade, the blood, and the truth. The truth is that he did what he had to do, that it was not enough, and that the war never really ends. It just changes shape, moving from the jungle to the mind, from the battlefield to the bedroom, from the noise to the silence. The silence is where the war, the medal, and the memory live, and it is where Miller lives, alone, with the ghosts, the men, and the silence. The end is not near. It is here, now, always. The assertion that American technological superiority alone won the war is a comfortable lie told by men who never had to clear a jammed M60, while bullets chewed up the dirt around their boots. Miller's story, and the stories of the 42 men who died that day, proves that hardware matters, but human will matters more. The F4 Phantoms delivered the force that broke the enemy's spine, combining power with precision. They dropped the bombs that turned a human wave into a crater. Fact remains. But it was Miller's hand, shaking and bloody, that pulled the pin on the grenade when the machine gun failed. It was his decision, made in a split second, that kept the platoon alive until the sky opened up. Victory existed in the air, yes, but also in the mud and the refusal to die. You might think the medal was enough. You might think the Bronze Star, the citation, the parade, and the applause were sufficient payment for the trauma of war. They were not. The cost of competence includes shaking hands and hearing loss. But mostly it is the memory that never fades. It is the image of the enemy, professional and skilled, walking into the line with discipline and courage. It is the knowledge that the command structure failed them, that the maps were wrong, and that the intelligence was ignored. The system saved them with air power, but it almost killed them with incompetence. Victory and pride are real, but so is the pain. The truth is that the men on the ground had to be better than the machine that sent them there. Miller lives in Austin, Texas. He works as a mechanic for a local trucking company. He fixes diesel engines, not M60s. He likes the work. It is honest. It is predictable. The engines do not jam because of bad leadership. They jam because of worn parts, and he fixes them. He has a wife, 2 children, and a dog. He goes to church on Sundays. He does not talk about the war, the grenade, or the 42 men who died. Instead, he discusses the weather, the price of gas, and the game. It is a normal life, a good life, earned. But it is built on the foundation of that day in the jungle. The foundation is solid, the house stands, but the ground beneath it is still scarred. He looks at the medal sometimes. It sits on his dresser. He does not wear it. He does not need to. He understands its meaning, his actions, the enemy's efforts, and who won. The Americans won that day. We won that battle. We had the better weapons, the better pilots, and the better soldiers. We had the will to fight and the skill to win. The enemy was defeated. They were broken by our air power and our grit. This truth is neither comfortable nor clean, but it is the only thing that matters. Miller's son asked him once, when he was 12, what it was like. Miller paused. He looked at his hands. They were steady now. He looked at the window. The sun was shining. His mind returned to the jungle, the smoke, the noise, and the silence. He recalled the grenade, the phantoms, and the men who died. He did not want to lie or glorify. He wanted to tell the truth. He turned to his son. His voice was low, calm, and final. We had the better guns, we had the better planes, and we had the better men. That is why we won.